The night I got transferred to work alongside a woman 18 years older than me, I understood something about corporate Canada that nobody puts in the onboarding materials. The open office doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about the reaction on everyone else's face when they think you haven't noticed them looking. My name is Cole Whitmore. I was 29, recently out of a 4-year relationship that had ended the way a lot of things end in your late 20s. Not with a fight, not with betrayal, just with two people slowly discovering they had been agreeing with each other for so long that neither of them remembered what they actually thought about anything. I had been in Vancouver for 8 months, new city, new apartment, new job at an urban planning firm called Meridian Group. I knew 3 people: my coworker Dex, my landlord, and the barista at the coffee shop below my building, who had stopped asking my name after the first week because I came in every morning with the same order and the same expression of a man who needed caffeine before he could produce personality. Then my manager, a reasonable man named Gareth who communicated primarily through calendar invites, told me I was being assigned to co-lead a project with someone named Adra Simone. I didn't know who Adra Simone was. I did know that when Gareth said her name, he paused for exactly half a second longer than he needed to. The way people pause when they are deciding whether to give you a warning or just let the experience teach you. He did not give me a warning. The project was a heritage redevelopment proposal for a stretch of older commercial buildings in East Vancouver. The kind of work I actually loved, figuring out how to keep something from disappearing just because it had gotten inconvenient. I walked into the first meeting 5 minutes early. Audra was already there. She was standing at the window with a coffee cup and a printed set of site plans, reviewing them the way someone reads a document they've already read twice and are now checking for what they missed. She was in her late 40s, dark natural hair, cut short, reading glasses pushed up to her forehead, wool blazer, good quality, the kind of thing that lasts a decade if you buy it right once. She looked up when I walked in, not curious, assessing. "You're Cole?" she said. "That's me?" She looked back at the plans. "You've done heritage files before?" 2. Commercial conversion in Calgary, 1 residential adaptive reuse in New Westminster. Good. She set her coffee down. "Then you already know the part where everyone has an opinion and nobody wants to pay for it." That was it. No small talk, no warm-up, just straight into the work. I liked it immediately. I also knew enough to understand that liking something immediately, before you fully understand it, is how you end up surprised later. The surprise came 3 weeks in. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing about how offices work. The real dynamics are never dramatic. They're ambient. They exist in the half-second too long that someone holds eye contact with you in the kitchen. The slight drop in volume when you and a particular colleague walk into a room together. The joke that happens just slightly too loud from someone who wants to be heard. Adra and I had fallen into a rhythm on the project. She handled the heritage assessment and stakeholder consultation. I managed the design documentation and city submissions. We had a standing meeting Tuesday mornings and talked when the work required it. The conversations were clean, efficient. She said things that were usually 10 degrees sharper than what I had been about to say, and I had stopped trying to get there first. The issue was that some people in the office had started to notice we worked well together. I want to be precise about this. The problem was not the working well together part. The problem was that Audra was 18 years older than me, divorced, and known around the office as someone who did not involve herself socially in ways that made people comfortable. She brought food to the kitchen and never hovered to make sure people liked it. She disagreed in meetings without apologizing for disagreeing. She had 2 published papers in planning journals and no LinkedIn photo, which certain people found deeply suspicious. And I was 29, new to the office, young enough that a few people had clearly already decided which version of me they were comfortable with. The junior guy who deferred, who laughed at the right volume, who asked senior staff questions in a way that made them feel senior without threatening to actually learn anything too fast. The Tuesday I understood this clearly, Audra and I were eating lunch at the corner table near the windows. Not by design. The kitchen had been busy, the boardroom was booked, and we both had the same meeting in 40 minutes, so it made sense to stay close to the documents. Dex came in, saw us, and did a thing with his face that he probably thought was invisible. A kind of suppressed amusement. He got his lunch from the fridge, said hey to both of us, and left. Later that afternoon, I passed by the cluster of desks near the east wall and heard his voice, not loud, just audible enough, saying something about the Project Dream Team. Then a laugh, then the word compatible, delivered with a very specific kind of emphasis that made it mean something other than good at working together. I kept walking. When I got back to my desk, I sat for a moment and thought about what the easy thing to do was. The easy thing was to let it drift. Keep the work professional. Stop having lunch in places where the optics made people think they had something to talk about. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the social math of a 30-person office, and in social math, the easiest thing and the correct thing are almost never the same equation. The next Tuesday, I got my lunch, walked to the corner table, and sat down across from Audra. She looked up from her screen. You look like you made a decision. I made a decision. About the Cordova Street alignment? No. She waited. That was another thing about Audra. She didn't fill silences. She let you arrive at the point on your own, which was either patience or efficiency, and I was never entirely sure which. Some people in the office think this is funny, I said. Y'all working closely. She set her fork down, not surprised. That was the part that landed wrong. She wasn't surprised at all. I know. How long? Week 2. She looked out the window briefly. I've been here 9 years, Cole. I know how the room reads. Does it bother you? She was quiet for a second. It used to. Now it mostly just tells me things about the room that are useful to know. I thought about that. What does it tell you? That some people are more comfortable with my competence if it has a punchline attached. She picked her fork back up. That's information. I looked at her for a second. Then I said, I'm not going to make this convenient for them. Adra looked at me then in a way she hadn't before. Not warm. More like she was deciding whether I had understood something or only thought I had. That sounds like a statement, she said. It is. Statements are easy. Her voice was even. Staying consistent after the statement is where people usually develop other priorities. That landed. I liked that she didn't hand out points for intentions. Fair, I said. She went back to her screen, but I saw the corner of her mouth move, barely. The project went to its next phase. We presented to the Heritage Committee together, which meant 2 hours in a heritage office in Gastown with 4 people who had deeply held opinions about cornices. Audra walked them through the documentation with a precision I found genuinely hard to watch without wanting to take notes. She knew when to let someone feel like they'd made a contribution and when to redirect without them noticing. At one point, a committee member started down a path that would have added 3 months to the timeline, and Audra said, that's an interesting lens, though if we approach it that way, we lose the protection on the Strathcona boundary, which I don't think this committee wants to be responsible for. The man reversed course so smoothly it almost looked like his idea. Afterward, standing outside on the sidewalk while we waited for a cab back to the office, I said, you do that on purpose. Do what? Let people believe they changed their own mind. She glanced at me. Only when they're about to make a mistake. She flagged the cab. If they're genuinely contributing, I let them know. I got in the cab. How do you know the difference? 18 years of experience. She said it without vanity, just information. That evening, back in my apartment with leftover Thai food, and one of those hockey games I had on as background noise, more than television, I thought about the last few weeks and noticed something that I didn't entirely want to notice. I was looking forward to the Tuesday meetings, not the project specifically, the conversations around the project. The way Audra said things that rearranged my thinking and didn't wait around to be thanked for it. That was when I understood the situation was slightly more complicated than I had been allowing myself to consider. The next week, Gareth called us both into his office. The heritage file was being fast-tracked. The city wanted a preliminary submission in 6 weeks rather than 12. This was good news professionally, and the kind of news that turned the next month into a blur of site visits, city hall meetings, and more cornice-related email threads than any human being should reasonably send. Adra and I started meeting 3 times a week instead of 1. The work was genuinely good, the kind of project where the actual problem was interesting and the solution required you to think carefully rather than just work hard. At some point in week 4 of the fast track, We stayed late on a Thursday. The office had emptied by 7. We were at the long table in the main boardroom, the one with the good light and the whiteboard that actually worked, going through a set of structural drawings that needed annotation before the morning. Adra had taken her blazer off and draped it over the chair. She had her glasses on properly for once, instead of pushed up. There was a half-eaten granola bar on her side of the table that I suspected was supposed to have been dinner. At some point after 9, she sat back and said, "You should go home. So should you. I'll be 20 minutes. Then I'll be 20 minutes." She looked at me over her glasses. "I don't need company." "I know. I need the annotation done before tomorrow because I have 2 other files in the morning." She held my gaze for a second, checking whether that was the real reason. I let her check. It was the real reason, or most of it. "Fine," she said. "Then be useful." I was useful. We finished by 10. Walking out through the empty lobby of the building, she asked if I was taking transit, and I said yes. And she said she was parked on the street, but she walked to the corner with me, anyway, which was not technically on the way to her parking spot. I noticed and didn't say anything. She pulled her coat tighter against the October air and said, "Good work this month. You too." Obviously. A dry pause. "I've been doing it longer." I laughed. She didn't, but her expression did something that was adjacent to a smile. The 99 came around the corner. I got on. She walked back toward her car. I sat down and looked out the window as the bus pulled away and thought, this is either going to be very good or extremely inconvenient. It turned out to be both. I told no one. That seemed important. Not because I was ashamed or unsure. I had gotten past unsure somewhere around week 3, and shame required something to be wrong, which I didn't think this was. But because the office had already decided what the story was, and the story they decided on was not one I wanted to hand them material for. What I hadn't counted on was that Audra was going to be more complicated than I'd understood. She wasn't cold, she was careful. There's a difference that I didn't fully grasp until I was inside it. Cold people don't let things show. Careful people are letting things show, but only after deciding it's intentional. Audra was the most intentional person I had ever been around, which meant that every small thing she gave you felt like a considered decision. She texted me a photo of a heritage brick detail from a building in Chinatown one Saturday afternoon with the message, "Owner says it's irreplaceable." It isn't. Brick match circa 1912. Good luck telling him. No context needed. I texted back the name of a supplier in New Westminster. She replied, "Obviously, I was seeing if you knew." I sent back, "Did I pass?" She sent marginally. The project submission went in on time. Gareth took the team for drinks at a bar on Cambie to celebrate. 12 people, good mood, the kind of evening that comes with a work milestone that actually mattered. I sat down the table from Audra because that was where the empty chairs were, and because proximity in a social setting, after months of professional proximity, was not something I wanted to handle in front of 12 coworkers. Somewhere around the second round, Dex appeared beside me. He had the expression of someone who has decided to have a conversation they'd been rehearsing. "You and Audra are pretty tight now, huh?" he said. "We worked the same file for 3 months." "Sure." He sipped his beer. "She talked to you about the Heritage Award nomination?" I hadn't heard about a nomination. "No." Gareth put her forward. "Big deal. Provincial level." Dex said it neutrally, but his eyes were doing the thing again. The thing where something was being communicated that wasn't the sentence. She'd be the youngest person ever to get it at her category. Youngest in a while, anyway. I looked at him evenly. "That's good for the firm." "Yeah." Pause. "Funny how things work out." I looked at him directly then, not hostile. "Just clear. What's funny about it?" Dex shrugged, realized the shrug wasn't landing where he wanted it to, and moved on to talk to someone else. That evening, walking out from the bar, Audra fell into step beside me on the sidewalk. Natural, like it had been decided somewhere I wasn't consulted. The rest of the group had spilled out in different directions. The night was cold. That clear Vancouver cold that comes in November before the rain settles in for good. "Dex said something to you," she said. "Not a question. How do you know?" "Because you've been looking at things very carefully since the second round, and you only do that when you're thinking about something you haven't decided how to say." I looked at her. "Is that what that looks like?" "From the outside." I told her what he'd said. Not editorialized, just the words and the pause and the shrug. She listened without expression. Then she said, "He's not wrong that the nomination is a big deal. I know. He's also doing the thing where people imply something without having to be responsible for having said it. I know that too." I stopped at the corner, where she usually turned toward the parking structure. "Does it bother you?" She turned to face me. "The nomination? No. The implication that I somehow got there by managing the perceptions of a 29-year-old? A little. I didn't think it worked that way. It doesn't." Her voice stayed even. "But this is the part where I tell you something clearly, Cole, and I need you to hear it without making it about reassuring me." She waited for me to nod. I nodded. "I have spent a long time being managed by rooms. Other people's discomfort about what I represent, or how old I am, or whether I smile enough in the right direction. I don't do that anymore. So if what's happening between us continues to happen, I need it to be something we both understand clearly, not something I'm waiting for you to catch up to." I looked at her on that corner for a moment. The SkyTrain hummed somewhere above us. A cyclist went past. I said, "I caught up around week 3. Audra blinked once. Then she said, "That's earlier than I expected. When did you?" She looked at me steadily. "Earlier than I wanted to." That answer did something to the air between us. She felt it too. I could tell because she looked away first, which was the only time I had ever seen her look away first. "I'm not going to make this easy," she said. "I know." "You don't know. Not yet." Her voice was still even. "I've been in a room long enough to know that a young man doing something decent in public sometimes mistakes that for having already done the work. I need the private version of you to match the public one. Tell me what that means specifically." She looked back. "It means I'm not a chapter in your story about being braver than other men your age." That line stayed in the air. I waited. Then I said, "And if you're not a chapter?" She looked at me. "Then what are you proposing, Cole?" "I don't know yet. Honest. But I know it's not a chapter." Audra studied me the way she studied site plans, looking for the structural flaw, the weak joint, the place where something would fail under pressure. She didn't find what she was looking for, or she found something different. "Thursday," she said. "There's a restaurant on Commercial that I've been meaning to try. No work." "Yes. And don't wear the blue shirt from the presentation. You looked like you were trying to convince the Heritage Committee you were emotionally reliable." I laughed. She walked away toward her car. Thursday was dinner. Dinner was 2 hours that became 3, because neither of us noticed until the server came by to mention they were closing the kitchen. We talked about the city, which we both had opinions on, that were different in the right ways. We talked about how she ended up in planning from an architecture background. We talked about my relationship and why it ended, and she listened without performing sympathy, which was more comforting than sympathy would have been. She told me she'd been married 8 years. He was also a planner, which she now believed was the error. "Too much shared vocabulary," she said. "After a while, we could have entire arguments using only professional terminology." The relationship ended and I submitted it to a journal. I laughed so suddenly that the table next to us looked over. She told me that when the marriage ended, she had spent 2 years putting enormous energy into her work, which was what she'd have done anyway, but at least the grief had a container. She said she didn't regret the marriage. She regretted some of the years after it that she'd spent being cautious about the wrong things and careless about others. "What were the wrong things?" I asked. "Letting rooms decide how I should feel about what I wanted." She picked up her water. "I spent a lot of time managing the comfort of people who weren't going to remember me fondly regardless." I looked at her. "And what were you careless about?" "Believing that caution was the same as wisdom." She said it plainly, like she'd already worked through it enough times that the sentence had stopped being painful. "It isn't. Caution is just fear with better posture." That went through me and stayed. We walked out into the Commercial Drive evening. The street had its usual Friday night energy. Restaurants, a few live music sounds drifting from somewhere. People sitting outside the coffee places despite the cold because it was Vancouver, and people would always sit outside if given any excuse at all. Audra had her coat done up and was walking at a pace that matched mine, which should not have been remarkable, and somehow was. I said, "My whole life people have told me I'm mature for my age." They were being condescending. I know. But it still felt like something. She glanced at me. "Now? Now I just feel 29. which is, I don't know, more honest. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 29 isn't young, Cole. Not really. You're just the youngest person in most of the rooms you walk into, and you've started to believe the room's description of you. I thought about that. Have you? Have I what? Started to believe the room's description of you. She stopped at a corner. Thought about the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then, I used to. Not anymore. The room calls me intimidating. What that means is I don't adjust myself to make other people feel comfortable, and people who expect women to adjust find that threatening. She started walking again. I find it efficient. Is that what I am? I said. Efficient? She made a small sound that I think was a laugh. You're inconvenient, she said. Which is different, I said. I'll take it. That was how it started. Not with a grand moment. Just with the specific ordinary work of two people deciding to take each other seriously. The office noticed, eventually. Not because we announced anything or changed how we behaved at work, we didn't. We remained professional with the competence of two people who had both learned, separately, that the professional version of yourself was not the enemy of the real one. But offices are not unintelligent environments. People who work closely with you accumulate data. Gareth figured it out first. He said nothing, which was the appropriate response and one I appreciated. He just made sure we weren't assigned to evaluate each other's performance going forward, which was administrative good sense. Dex found out through what I can only describe as the ambient social intelligence of an open-plan office. He came to me on a Tuesday in December and said, with the expression of a man genuinely revising a prior position, okay, I had it wrong. About what? About whatever I thought was funny. He paused. She's sharp as hell. Yes, I said. She is. She made Gareth reverse the Burnaby file submission deadline using only one sentence and a look. What sentence? She said. I wonder what the Provincial Oversight Office would think of that timeline. He shook his head. One sentence. The man folded like a map. I smiled. Also, Dex said, she corrected my structural reference in the team meeting and was right, so. Yes, I said. She's usually right. He nodded slowly. Okay, so, carry on. It wasn't a grand apology. It was a grown man arriving somewhere more accurate than he started. I respected it more than a speech would have been. 6 months in, I helped Adra hang new work at the gallery space she'd been renting for a collective show, a group of Vancouver architects and urban planners who made visual art on the side, which she had never mentioned to anyone at work, because she didn't feel she owed the office a complete inventory of herself. There were photographs she'd taken of demolition sites in the 90s. Not sad, precise. The way she said everything, clear about what was there and what was already leaving. I stood in front of one for a long time, a building mid-collapse, caught at the exact second where it still looked like a building and already looked like material. She came and stood beside me. What do you see? She asked. I see something that doesn't know it's already decided. She was quiet. Then, that was the point. She got the Heritage Award nomination, and then the award itself, which was a ceremony in Victoria that I drove down with her for, and sat 3 rows back because she had colleagues there who didn't need to be presented with context before the evening began. Afterwards, she found me at the reception, handed me a glass of bad white wine, and said, "Thank you for being here and not making it complicated." "I'm practicing," I said. "You're getting better." The city kept changing around us. We found a rhythm that had nothing to do with the office and everything to do with who we actually were when the professional framework fell away. She cooked on Sundays. I learned that she had strong opinions about coffee, weak opinions about television, and zero tolerance for people who described things as just a little bit more complex than it sounds. She learned that I was better at big decisions than small ones, that I could not parallel park in tight spaces without a 3-point turn, and that I read planning documents in bed like other people read novels, which she found either endearing or baffling depending on the day. We disagreed about things. Specifically, and without drama. She thought I was too quick to accommodate client feedback before we'd fully defended the original position. I thought she sometimes made the revision process feel like an interrogation of the client's entire value system, which was accurate but occasionally slow. We had both of those conversations directly and then went back to the work. A year in, she met my mother when my mother came through Vancouver for a conference, and we all had dinner at a Japanese restaurant in Yaletown. My mother was a retired high school principal and had the posture of a woman who had spent 3 decades listening carefully to people who thought they were fooling her. She and Audra talked about city planning and heritage preservation and school building design for 45 minutes, and my name came up twice, both times as supporting material for a different point. Driving back across the Burrard Bridge, my mother said, "She's impressive. I know. She also doesn't need you, Cole." A pause. "That's not a warning. That's a compliment to both of you." I thought about that for a long time after she said it. The difference between someone choosing you because you fill a gap and someone choosing you when there's no gap to fill. The way those two things feel from the outside can be indistinguishable. From the inside, they're completely different. Audra had told me early on that she didn't need saving, a younger man's energy, or someone who would eventually want her to be less than she was, so the balance between them made more conventional sense. I had said I understood. She had said understanding wasn't the same as knowing from experience. She had been right. Over the first year, I found out what she meant in small, specific moments, times when I wanted to smooth something over and she didn't need it smoothed, or when I wanted to advocate loudly for something she was handling with a precision that didn't require volume. Each time I stopped myself from the unnecessary instinct, I understood more clearly what it meant to actually be present for someone rather than forming presence for them. 2 years on a Sunday afternoon in the apartment she'd moved into in Mount Pleasant, a third-floor place with a garden view and exactly the right proportion of light. She was reading at the kitchen table, and I was annotating a report for a project in Nanaimo, and there was a podcast on low in the background, and the window was open because it was May, and Vancouver in May is the city at its most persuasive. She looked up once and said, "You're distracted." "I'm thinking. About the Nanaimo file?" "No." She waited. "About the fact that I want to ask you something, and I can't decide if the timing is right, or I'm just afraid to wait." She set her book down. Fully. Not the way people set books down when they're pausing. The way people set books down when the conversation has become the point. I didn't have a ring. I hadn't planned the sentence. What I had was 2 years of learning what it meant to be with someone who demanded nothing from you except the truth. "Audra," I said, "I am not asking because I want to make a statement. I'm asking because every time I picture the next decade, you're there. Not as a category or a narrative, just you, specifically." She looked at me for a long moment. "That's less romantic than it should be." "Do you want more romantic?" "No," she said. "I want accurate. That's accurate." She was quiet. The garden outside the window had that particular Vancouver May light that makes everything look like it's been slightly improved. She looked at me the way she looked at the demolition photographs, clear about what was there and what it meant. "Yes," she said. "Obviously. Don't make it a production." I didn't. We sat at the table together and finished our respective work, and I ordered food later, and she opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for an occasion she said she'd recognize when it arrived. Months later, someone at an event asked how we'd gotten together. The story had made rounds in the planning community, not viral, not dramatic. Just the ambient information that travels through professional networks when two people who are both known individually become known together. Audra told it simply. "We worked together, the work was good, the conversations were better." I added, "And the office had opinions which turned out to be useful information about the office." Audra glanced at me. "He's been waiting to say that for 2 years. Since about week 3, I said. She picked up her wine. "He's marginally punctual. The truth was that nobody paired us on purpose. There was no mixer, no event, no organizer, with a red blazer and a headset. There was a project that needed 2 people, and the firm assigned the 2 most appropriate people, and some of those people's colleagues thought it was interesting for the wrong reasons, and none of that turned out to matter. What turned out to matter was what always turns out to matter, which is whether 2 people are willing to keep showing up clearly after the room has finished being interested in them. The room loses interest eventually. It always does. It moves on to the next it finds briefly amusing. What stays is what was actually there underneath the attention. And underneath the attention, there was just work, and conversation, and a woman who didn't need to be chosen but chose anyway, and a man who was just old enough to understand the difference.